Boston's More Than a Feeling became one of the most iconic songs in rock history. But the truth behind those drums is a story almost nobody tells. One drummer helped build the foundation, then got erased before the money ever came in. Another became the face of a sound that was never fully his. You know the song. You probably think you know who played it. You don't. Because while that sound was being built in secret, the man really calling the shots was still punching a clock at Polaroid. Chapter 1. The Furnace Room. Before there was a record deal, before that song was on every radio in America, there was a basement in Watertown, Massachusetts, and two guys trying to figure out what they had. Tom Scholz had met Jim Masdea through a local band called Freehold. Tom was an MIT-trained engineer working a day job at Polaroid. Jim was the drummer. And somewhere between 1973 and 1975, those two men built something that would outlast both of their names. Tom spent his house down payment fund wiring up a 12-track studio in his Watertown basement. He called it Foxglove Studios. Jim laid the drum foundation first, always the starting point. The groove, the feel, the architecture of the rhythm.
Just Tom and I. It wasn't Fran Sheehan, wasn't Sib Hashian, it wasn't Barry Goodrow, it wasn't Brad Delp, it wasn't any other player that's ever been in the band. Gary Peel, nobody. It was Tom and I. Tom rode my percussive foundation, my feel.
Tom overdubbed everything else on top. Guitars, bass, organ, layering track on track until the room sounded bigger than it had any right to. The 6-song demo they produced included More Than a Feeling and Peace of Mind. The Boston sound, that massive, clean, impossibly wide rock sound, started with Jim's drums. Everything else was built on top of what he laid down. And then someone heard the tape. That's where Jim's story takes a turn he never saw coming. Chapter 2. The Call. Promoters Paul Ahern and Charlie McKenzie heard the demo and moved fast. Tom and Brad Delp were signed to Epic/CBS. Boston was going to be a real band. There was just one condition. Jim had to go. Management made it clear he was out before any deal got finalized. The reasons given depend on who's talking. Tom claimed Jim wanted to play a flashy drum solo at the live audition, something that didn't fit the arrangements. Brad told a journalist that Jim had told him he was losing interest in playing drums. Brad added that Tom felt very bad when the whole thing happened. But court documents tell a different story. When the lawyers got involved years later, the paperwork was plain. Jim left the band unwillingly. So which version is true? The drummer who lost interest, or the drummer who got pushed out right before the money arrived? Consider this. The man spent years fighting in court to prove what he built. That's not the behavior of someone who didn't care. And the man they brought in to replace him had no idea what he was walking into. Chapter 3. The Ghost. Sib Hashian was a local drummer, no formal training, high energy. Introduced to Tom through bassist Fran Sheehan, and that introduction would define the rest of his life, though not in the ways he might have hoped. Here's what Sib was not asked to do: create. He wasn't brought in to develop his own parts or put his stamp on anything. He was handed Jim's arrangements and told to learn them, note for note, exactly as Jim had played them. Tom painstakingly guided him through every fill, every pattern, every transition. Sib became, in effect, a human playback machine for another drummer's work, hired to wear someone else's shoes and smile for the cameras. And then it gets worse. When the debut album was recorded, Tom brought Jim back into the studio to play drums on Rock and Roll Band. The man they'd replaced, invited back to lay down the track himself, at Tom's insistence. Sib's name on the rest of the album, Jim's hands on that song. He got a credit for it. One song out of the record he helped build from nothing. Sib, for his part, showed up, played hard, toured relentlessly, and gave that band everything he had. When Boston dropped in August 1976 and went gold in 7 weeks, he was the face behind the kit, a face built on another man's foundation. But there's one more piece of this story that almost nobody talks about. Chapter 4: The Decoy. The label thought the album was being recorded in LA. That was what Epic Records believed was happening. It wasn't. Tom had sent the band across the country as a decoy while he recorded the bulk of the debut album alone, in his Watertown basement. The same way he and Jim had always done it. He and producer John Boylan ran the whole thing like a con. Sib and the band were in LA, Tom was in Massachusetts, controlling every sound, every layer, every decision. The album that became the biggest debut in rock history was largely built by one man, in secret, while the drummer whose face would sell it waited 3,000 miles away. Boston hit stores in August 1976, 17 million copies. Sib on the cover, his name in the credits, the drum parts, the arrangements, the foundation of the whole record, trace straight back to the man who wasn't allowed in the room. That's the deal both drummers got. One built it and got erased. One fronted it and never fully owned it. Now imagine what happened when the pressure really started. Chapter 5: The Splice Job. Don't Look Back came out in 1978, and Tom hated it from the start. He called it a rush job. The label was pushing, the pressure was real, and the perfectionist who had spent years on the debut didn't have years this time. Sib laid down his drum takes, Tom edited them, and then edited them some more. The title track reportedly contains dozens of splices of Sib's performance. That's not editing. That's dismantling a drummer's work and rebuilding it from scraps until it matches something only Tom could hear in his head. The band was enormous by this point. They'd gone from opening for Black Sabbath and Foghat to headlining Madison Square Garden, the first band ever to sell it out on their New York debut. That's how big they were. And the drummer holding it all together live couldn't even fully own his own studio takes. Then the whole thing blew apart. Chapter 6: The Betrayal. The third album didn't come. A year passed, then another. Tom was dealing with studio renovations, a management breakdown, and what appeared to be a genuine personal unraveling. The label ran out of patience. CBS filed a $60 million breach of contract lawsuit against Tom for failing to deliver. They withheld his royalties for 7 years. $70 million worth of pressure pointed at one man. While Tom was stalled, Sib, guitarist Barry Goudreau, and Fran did the only thing they could think of. They kept working. They contributed to Barry's 1980 solo album, tried to stay active, tried to stay relevant. Tom viewed this as a betrayal, a corporate attempt to market a version of the band without him. Whether that's fair or paranoid depends on your point of view, but what happened next isn't up for debate. When Tom finally came back to make Third Stage, Sib was fired. And the man he brought back to replace him was Jim, the original drummer, the man they'd pushed out a decade earlier, back in the chair like none of it had ever happened. Except it had, and everybody knew it. Chapter 7: The Lawsuits. By the late 1980s, everyone was suing everyone. Sib went after Tom for back royalties. They settled out of court, terms undisclosed. But when the drummer who spent years as the public face of your band has to sue you to get what he's owed, that tells you everything about how it really ended between them. Then Jim, back in the band, theoretically vindicated, filed his own lawsuit. He sued Tom, Boston, and Sib under the Lanham Act, claiming his original drum arrangements had been misappropriated on the debut album. Under oath, he said it plain. Sib had simply learned, like a cover band would learn a song, and replayed them on the record. Think about this. The man who built those parts, sitting in a deposition describing the drummer who replaced him as a cover band musician playing someone else's work. That's what he believed. That's what he said on the record. The court ultimately dismissed the Lanham Act claim. Jim's own attorney conceded there wasn't enough to support it, but the case settled on other terms, and the words he said under oath, those never went away. Two drummers who between them gave everything to this band, and both ended up in a lawyer's office trying to claw back what should have been theirs from the beginning. They just got quiet, and that was supposed to be the end of it. Chapter 8. What happened to them? Jim was on the third stage sessions. He did the 1987 stadium tour, and even then, the pattern was already repeating. During the tour, Tom started removing Jim from promotional material and photos. Doug Huffman was being positioned to take over before the tour buses even stopped rolling. The man who'd been erased before the debut was being erased again, from the inside, while he was still on stage. Sib had a harder road. After Boston, he owned a record store called Soundwaves, ran a chain of tanning salons, played occasionally with former bandmates in a group called Ernie and the Automatics. Small venues, loyal crowds, the long tail of a career that had once filled arenas. A man who sold out Madison Square Garden, playing bars. In late 2016, he was diagnosed with kidney cancer. He kept playing anyway. On March 22, 2017, Sib died of a heart attack while performing on the Legends of Rock cruise ship. He was 67 years old. He died doing the only thing he'd ever really wanted to do, playing drums in front of people who loved the music.
You know, music needs a lot of people to come to its aid today because, a lot of people say, oh, music's not important. You know what? Music is important. And when music drives us, we're going to keep music healthy and alive.
Jim dug the dirt. Sib laid the floor. Tom built the house, then changed the locks on both of them. Everyone else paid the tab. The singers paid it too. Brad, the voice, the reason any of this worked, widely known as one of the nicest human beings in rock, gone on March 9th, 2007. After he died, Tom needed a miracle. He found one on MySpace. A Home Depot credit manager from North Carolina named Tommy DiCarlo had been posting Boston covers from his living room, grieving a band he loved the way fans do. Tom called him. Just like that, a guy who managed store credit accounts was headlining arenas. He carried that band for nearly 2 decades. And then, pay attention to this date. Brad died on March 9th, 2007. Tommy died on March 9th, 2026. Same date, 19 years apart. Both men who gave Boston its voice, gone on the same day of the calendar. The drummers who built the foundation, both eventually discarded. 2 singers who carried the voice, both gone on the same date, 19 years apart. At some point, you stop calling it a coincidence, and you start wondering what Tom calls it.